What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode. In today's video, we're gonna be working on the mini motor again. So I mentioned to you guys in the previous video that we'd be putting all the extra peripheral components onto the engine, putting the transmission, mating it up to the engine, and then throwing it in the engine bay. So in today's video, we're gonna get started with exactly that. I've got a bunch of parts behind me. They all need to be put on the block. So let's get started. This here is the current state of the engine, and we're about to completely transform it. Starting with the top of the engine, install the dipstick along with the dipstick bracket into the little hole in front of the cylinder head. Put a dab of oil on the O-ring to allow it to easily seat itself into the port. There's one hex bolt securing it in place. On the back side of the head, install the VANOS solenoid with the included Torx bolt and secure it in place. On the left side of the cylinder head, there are two camshaft driven components. This here is the high pressure fuel pump that's driven by the intake camshaft. If you're using your old HPFP, be sure to replace the O-ring that seals itself against the head with the new one to ensure that nothing leaks. Then torque each of the bolts to the proper torque spec. Moving now to the exhaust side, we have another component that is camshaft driven. This one here is my old vacuum pump. Now don't worry, I did not leave the pump like this. So what I did was I took the entire pump apart, I sandblasted the whole thing, and I couldn't exactly leave it in this state. I figured since I'm making the engine look so damn nice, I'm not gonna leave this one component here to make the whole thing look cheap, especially because it's on the front side of the engine. If you're using your old vacuum pump, I would suggest replacing all three of the O-rings that are found in the unit. There's going to be one of them that's sealed in between the vacuum pump and the cylinder head. There's going to be another one that's found on the inside component of the vacuum pump, and there's going to be another one found on the vacuum line that's facing upward. Now, once you replace all three of those, you know that your old vacuum pump is going to be running in perfect tip-top shape. Finally, torque each one of these bolts to the proper torque spec. It should look something like this when you're done. Next up, we're going to work on the bottom of the engine. This is a knock sensor, which is essentially a very sensitive microphone that's bolted to the block. It needs to be installed with medium strength thread locker to ensure it doesn't come out. You just need a little bit of the stuff on the threads to make it work. Found on the right side of the knock sensor, we need to install the stud for the intake manifold bracket in the evap canister. It goes bracket, stud, evap canister, and then nut. There are two other bolts securing the canister up to the block that need to be installed. Moving down to the lower portion of the block, we need to install the torque mount, which prevents the engine from rocking when under load. There are 4 bolts securing it in place. Moving now to the front of the engine, I'm installing the oil filter housing along with brand new gaskets up to the block. It's secured in place with 4 hex bolts. You will eventually see me remove this as it will interfere with the installation of the transmission. Following that, install the new oil cooler gaskets on the oil filter housing, followed by the oil cooler itself. There are 4 Torx bolts that secure it in place. You don't want any oil or coolant leaking from this spot. Next up is the water pump. I upgraded to a Febby water pump that comes with a metal impeller which will be able to withstand more abuse. Once the pump is torqued, you can then install the pulley onto the pump. The friction wheel can now be installed. However, it needs to be put into service mode. To put it into service mode, you pull on the little tab and it will allow the bottom part of the friction wheel to move out. There are 3 hex bolts that are securing it up to the block. On the front of the engine, we need to install the AC compressor mounting bracket, which secures into place with 2 hex bolts and 1 hex nut. This creates a mounting point for the AC compressor to mount to. The AC compressor secures itself with 3 hex bolts, 2 found on top and 1 on the bottom. Torque each one of them up to the proper manufacturer spec. Next up comes installing the alternator. This here is a replacement alternator. Now, my old one was in perfect working condition, but it was pretty rusty and I didn't want to have to go ahead and replace the alternator once the engine was back in. So what I would suggest you guys doing, if you guys have the engine out, try and do as much preventative maintenance as possible so you don't have to do it later. To secure it to the block, the serpentine belt tensioner needs to be mounted on the top of it, and the bolts securing it to the block feed through both components. With all the accessory components now on the engine, we can install the serpentine belt. Now, I've had great results with my other cars with continental belts, so I thought I'd do the exact same thing with my mini engine. You can see it's looped around the crankshaft pulley, underneath the AC compressor, above the alternator, and then underneath the tensioner. Now you guys can tell that it doesn't actually touch the coolant by any means. The friction wheel is what applies pressure to that area. The belt here should look something like this once it's installed. The next system to be installed is the direct injection fuel system. Each of these fuel injectors have new seals and have to be installed on the fuel rail in one shot. To seat the entire fuel rail onto the head, use the T45 Torx bolts and tighten them incrementally. Finally, torque all 4 of these bolts to the manufacturer spec. There is a fuel line that goes from the high pressure fuel pump to the fuel rail, and each of these needs to be threaded in carefully and then torqued to spec. Now unfortunately, you cannot use a torque wrench when doing something like this, as you can't fit a socket over top of it. So what we'll need is this handy tool called a crow's foot. You can put this attachment on your torque wrench, and then you can tighten up each one of these nuts on any kind of line. So if you guys are doing any kind of brake line or clutch line and you need a torque spec, these crow's feet come in really handy. Instead of kind of eyeballing it or guessing how much torque is on this line, you can precisely know with this torque spec and these feet attachments, you guys can put it on there and you know it's tight. Moving to the bottom of the engine, install the crankshaft position sensor along with the Torx bolt. This will complete the last peripheral component that needs to be installed on this engine. We can't install any more components to the engine with it installed on the stand. So it needs to come off, and then we need to position it on the ground so that we can further the install. We need to mate the transmission to the engine before it can go back in the engine bay. In order to do that, we must first install the clutch and flywheel assembly. This is a new single mass flywheel from Clutch Masters. It has oils on the mating surface to prevent it from rusting during the shipping step. We must remove all of that oil first to prevent the clutch disc from getting contaminated. Using some parts cleaner and a rag, wipe down the contact patch of the flywheel, and it will show you how much residue actually comes off. Next up comes installing the new clutch disc. This bad boy is rated for 550 torque, which is way more than what the engine is going to be pushing, which means it's going to be a reliable setup. I'm told that this 8-puck sprung clutch feels similar to the OEM one, while being able to withstand much more abuse. There's only one way to find out if that's true or not. When installing the clutch, be sure to install it in the correct orientation. Put the guide pin tool through the clutch disc to properly center it so that installing the transmission is a breeze. Clean the contact patch of the pressure plate, which can be done in the same manner as cleaning the flywheel. A little bit of parts cleaner and a rag will properly clean it. Align the pressure plate over top of the clutch and install all 6 bolts to secure it in place. Be sure to follow it up with any torque specification, as these are crucial to the operation of the clutch and flywheel assembly. Having to fix this or replace any kind of part in between the engine and transmission means we need to separate them, which is not an easy job. So be sure to take your time and do it right now. This next part is somewhat tricky, especially if you have the engine still in the engine bay. So the splines of the input shaft of the transmission need to perfectly align with the clutch plate. If the splines are slightly off, you will not be able to mate them together. This is by far the most difficult and potentially time-consuming procedure. You might be able to get it on the first try, or it might take you 20 minutes. I found it easiest to have the engine in the air with the transmission level on a stool. Once you get the engine's guide pins lined up with the holes in the transmission, it all should go in rather easily. Torque all 70 of these bolts that fasten the transmission to the engine. You can then install the starter on the backside of the engine using the 3 Torx bolts we removed during the disassembly. Now take a look at this setup. It looks absolutely unbelievable. So with it like this, we can now go ahead and put this back in the engine bay. So that is where this video is going to be concluding. In the next video, I'm going to start this back up, and the engine and transmission, fingers crossed, nothing else should be a hazard or problem. We can put that in there and hopefully get this mini engine running soon. If you guys want to see daily updates as to seeing what I'm doing, you guys can follow me on Instagram. I put stuff on my stories and new posts regarding everything that I'm doing here. So if you guys want more information about that, follow me at Milmast. You guys can find a link in the description box. If you guys want to find any of the products or tools that I'm using, you guys can find information in the description box as well, along with torque specs. So if you guys are doing this procedure to your car, you guys can find everything all right here. If you guys have any further questions about the video, comment section's down there. You guys know what to do by now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.